Up next, we have Charles Ohlson from Whiting Petroleum.
Good morning. Thank you for having me here today. It's a pleasure to be speaking to you about re-fracs. Going to give you a bit of an overview to start with, a backdrop, if you will. Currently in the Williston Basin, there are somewhere around 12 to 13,000 wells that penetrate the Bakken Formation. And Whiting operates somewhere around 1,400 of these wells. It's Meridian Oil that can be credited with the first company to drill horizontally in the Bakken shales actually in Billings County back in 1987. Important to remember, and Jeff touched on this, that a lot of the early completions, 2006 to 2010, were very limited by technology. And finally, the map here, borrowed from a recent SPE paper, kind of shows you the surface locations of all the Bakken and Three Forks locations across the Williston Basin. Bakken wells indicated in orange and Three Forks in blue. It kind of gives you some idea of where the trends are across the basin. Just a quick lesson on wellbore construction. Two types of wells here that are drilled in the Williston Basin. By far the most prevalent is the horizontal well. If I were to stand above a well and slice it, right down the middle, this is kind of what you would see. On the left here, the horizontal well is a typical 3-string design that we do now. All of those strings cemented in, at least that's what Whiting's doing. The horizontal portion is about 2 miles in most cases, and that's where all the work is. That's where we frack it in 30 to 50 stages, 8 to 15 million pounds of sand. So on the right is a vertical well. You can see much simpler, and there's still some of this work being done across the basin, but not nearly as prevalent as horizontal. So let's talk about fracking a bit before we get into refracking. So what is a frac? A frac is shortened from hydraulic fracture stimulation treatment. The first one was done a long time ago, about 70 years ago in Kansas, and we've come a long ways. The basic goal of a frac job is to create this highly conductive path from the formation to the wellbore to accelerate and enhance oil recovery. And what do they look like? Well, on the far left is a picture of a Whiting refrac here recently, just east of Williston, so a lot of surface equipment and horsepower. But more interestingly, the things I think about are, what does it really look like downhole? Well, a lot of people have opinions, and the central picture is just one artist's idea of what a frac might look like down there. It busts apart the formation in a somewhat explosive geometry. But in reality, and this comes from a lot of mine back studies as well, it simply probably looks a lot more like the photo on the right, which is just a crack in an outcrop. The only difference is when we're finished, ours are filled with sand. So that gives you some idea of what fracs look like. How's it done and what's in it? So to do a frac, we have to get a lot of horsepower out there, and we pump water and sand and safe chemicals at a very high rate. A high enough rate to overcome the leak off into the formation and actually hydraulically split it, and that enables us to slip that sand in there and keep it wedged open. On the left here is a picture showing the very common mesh sizes that are used across the Williston Basin, and then 3 very common fluid systems varying in viscosity, and we apply those in different areas and in different volumes depending on our strategy and the area. So how much of this stuff do we pump? So just to give you an idea on something that's somewhat relatable, we're pumping somewhere around 200 to 300,000 barrels per well. On average, that's just an average. That's enough to fill 18 Olympic-sized swimming pools, so a fairly substantial volume of water. How much sand? So Jeff commented on some of the recent sand loadings. It comes out to somewhere between 8 and 15 million pounds per well. That's what most operators are kind of aiming for these days. So basically 27 wells worth of sand could fill your North Dakota State Capitol building. So a fairly amount of large volume of sand and proppant per well. Looking at the evolution of completion technologies over the last 10 or 11 years, we started out, as Jeff mentioned, with something relatively humble and simple, just a slotted liner running a well, and we rear back and we pump a giant stage and we just hope that the whole thing gets stimulated. And in reality, we probably only make, a very limited number of fracs per well, and the results reflected that. This is probably represents a lot of the old Elm Coulee completions. We got smarter as time went on. We found ways to isolate and create more fracs along that lateral, either with packer systems, where we could create at least one fracture in between those packers, or later on with the cemented liner plug and perf completions. And of course, the well results spoke for themselves. So moving into a re-frac, what is it? Why do we do it? So the reason I gave you the background on fracking is because re-fracs and fracs are very similar. In fact, re-fracs are possibly easier from an operational standpoint because you generally pump, at least in certain styles of re-fracking, with fewer stages and minimal shutdowns. And because the wells are depleted, your treating pressures are generally lower, so a little easier there. Use the same basic ingredients. One of the big differences, and Jeff touched on this, is the well preparation. Depending on your style of re-frac, it can be quite a bit different from the preparation prior to a typical frac. And ensuring that wellbore integrity really is key for re-fracs because those wells are a little older now. So two basic schools of thought in re-frac. One, a technique for recovering more reserves. To do that, you have to contact new portions of the reservoir. The other is maybe finding some wells out there that were originally completed pretty well, but for whatever reason have lost connection between the wellbore and the formation, and those fracs just need to be dressed up with a little re-frac. In 2014, Whiting embarked on a relatively modest re-frac campaign in one of its fields, the Sanish area in Montreal County. We chose 4 wells we thought were good candidates. Job execution went just fine. These are the production curves that were touched on earlier. The shaded in green portions would be the interpreted incremental reserves. And as you can see, all of them made at least some early time incremental, but the 2 on the right were overall economically unsuccessful. So in 2016, back to the drawing board. As prices went down in 2016, Whiting looked for some economically competitive projects, thought of re-fracs, came up with a basic 5-step program to evaluate and execute re-fracs. Step number 1, of course, is the candidate selection phase, arguably the most important phase. Number 2, design and engineering. 3, the economic analysis. 4, the execution. And then 5, of course, the feedback loop. We're trying to learn from these things. So just a quick example maybe on re-frac preparation, how we might set up a well and execute. On the top here is a schematic borrowed from a recent SP paper. The 2 black lines that are perpendicular to the wellbore would indicate the original fracs. The red portion would be where we go in and maybe re-perforate the well in between the original fracs. And then the design down here, you can see several, it looks like a heart monitor basically. Those are cycles, and Jeff touched on the diversion. So we pump sand and we drop a diversion material in hopes of spreading out that re-frac material all up and down the wellbore as opposed to just going into one spot. The diversion material looks like this. It's generally a particulate diversion. We use a polylactic acid. It's a thermoplastic that's biodegradable. It goes down there, plugs things off temporarily, and over the course of hours and days degrades after the job, and of course you get the connection of the portion that you plugged off. So we might do anywhere from 15 to 30 cycles with this diverter during a standard re-frac. And then you might ask, well, how do you know where it goes? Well, sometimes when you're pumping it, you don't necessarily know where it goes at the time. You're hoping, but you're also using the diverter and then surface indicators like pressure and rate to understand whether or not you're breaking down new formation or going into an existing perforations in an old frac. So afterward, though, we can run in fiber optics. It's basically like a long thermometer, but it can measure temperature all along the wellbore. And wherever you see wellbore cooling would indicate where your re-frac exited the wellbore. And of course, you hope to see that and plan to see that where you created new pathways and new perforations to new portions of the reservoir. So I'll wrap it up by discussing 4 of our recent re-fracs. We did one back in 2016 in October. This is the one with the most history on it, the most recent one. In Dunn County, we re-fracked it with 2.4 million pounds of sand after cleaning it out and adding perforations. And a fairly modest uplift, 25 to 175 barrels a day, but very stable production afterwards. As you can see, we generated a lot of incremental reserves, and this well continues to be strong today, and we've evaluated it to be an economic project. The second, in June of 2017, we revisited our Sanish field again, and in Montreal County. We cleaned it out, added perfs, refracted it with 3.6 million pounds of sand, and got a pretty good uplift, 25 barrels a day to 200 barrels a day. We're very pleased with the early performance. It's a little early yet for us to understand how many incremental reserves that we made, but we're initially pretty pleased and optimistic. Also in June, in McKenzie County, we refracted a well in our Hidden Bench asset area with 2.1 million pounds of sand. This was a little bit different project. This was a parent well where we had drilled 6 wells nearby in the same drilling spacing unit. And prior to completing those child wells, we refracted the parent well. And of course, we were interested to see that our, not only did we have a great uplift on the refrac well, but our child wells performed far above expectations. We think that had something to do with the refrac on the parent well. And then the final one, we did another one in June here in our Tarpon area, which is also McKenzie County. And this was probably our most successful refrac, 3 million pounds, an uplift from 65 barrels a day to 450. And this was our first refrac of a cemented liner completion, which is sort of the modern version of our current completions. And we used a much more aggressive approach on our diverters and got some really outstanding results. We're very pleased with all of these and look forward to the economic evaluations. So to summarize, the Williston Basin has a ton of wells, almost 13,000, so a lot of opportunities out there for refracs. Refracs are similar to standard fracs in many ways, some ways easier. The same materials are used for both. It should be noted that, at least in our opinion, the refrac candidate selection is probably the most important piece. Certainly job execution is important and minimizing issues, but you have to start with a good candidate. And then, of course, there are a growing number of refracs. A lot of companies are doing it, some more than others, and we're learning. We're learning. We plow those results back into our models and continue to get better at evaluating refracs. And finally, the technologies for improving refrac techniques and measuring their success continue to improve. Appreciate you guys having me this morning. Thank you.